In the early 2000s, a book came out about the relationship between China's first leader, Mao Zedong, and his first premier, Zhou Enlai. The two were a complete contrast to each other. Mao was this larger-than-life figure, almost a fanatic. He was front and center of the armed struggle against the Kuomintang and the establishment of the PRC. He was also the central figure responsible for everything that happened in China in the 50s and 60s, from the Great Leap Forward down to the disastrous Cultural Revolution. Zhou, on the other hand, was a diplomat. He was polished, suave, worldly wise. But there was one thing that always stood out. Zhou Enlai was always, throughout his entire life, subservient to Mao Zedong. And that meant that the power equation was always favorable to Mao. Zhou basically survived by eternally deferring to Mao and his leadership. This week on Crux Decode, we look at the relationship between the current president of China, Xi Jinping, and his deputy, the premier, Li Keqiang. This past week, there's been much speculation about the missing president of China, Xi Jinping. The China Media Project ran a story about how Xi Jinping had gone missing from the front pages of the state-run newspaper, The People's Daily. In some instances, he had been missing for more than 20 days straight. In China's tightly controlled media environment, most lead news items happen to be what the president or the premier did, what they said, what they inaugurated, etc. There is hardly anything critical of the Chinese government or even the Chinese Communist Party that's covered in state-run media. So Xi Jinping missing from the media coverage, missing from the front pages of the premier state-run newspaper in China, that did get the antennas of lots of folks up. Experts argued, citing Xi's absence from the front page of the newspaper, that his economic and COVID policies were facing backlash from the people and also, more importantly, from the upper echelons of the Communist Party. There have been prolonged lockdowns in both Shanghai and Beijing, that's the two biggest cities. There's been a lot of resentment against these lockdowns. In fact, many of these videos of protests and people hooting and howling and screaming, this has gone viral on social media as well. In China, word is that all of this is being pursued under the word and instructions of one man, Xi Jinping. It is what the Chinese call the zero COVID policy. Now, many Chinese citizens have been complaining that at a time when the rest of the world, whether it's in the United States, whether it's countries in Europe, have all pretty much learned to live with the virus or moved on from the coronavirus, China pursuing a zero COVID policy at this time, 2 years after COVID struck, doesn't make any sense. Now, more than anything else, people argue that it is hurting the world's second largest economy. Now, you contrast this with what is happening with the second most important person in China, that is the premier, Li Keqiang. The premier held a rare nationwide meeting via teleconference last week to bolster an economy that's been battered by COVID. The timing and the scale of the meeting indicated to analysts that there was a level of urgency, that current challenges that the country is facing right now need to be overcome and need to be overcome very quickly if China has any hope of meeting its annual GDP target of 5.5% this year. Li Keqiang, in that meeting, which was widely televised, widely publicized, he said, and I quote, "The difficulties in some areas and to a certain degree are even greater than the severe shock of the pandemic in 2020, unquote. He also warned how the economy is at a critical point for determining its full-year trajectory. He also called on officials to work hard for growth in the second quarter and see a drop in unemployment. Now, this was an 8,000-word speech. It was made at the 5th State Council's Clean Government Work Conference that happened on the 25th of April. It was published in full on the second page of the People's Daily. And that, of course, is leading to all kinds of speculation that all may not be well in paradise, that there may be serious differences between Xi Jinping, the president, and Li Keqiang, the premier. The news agency Bloomberg reported last week that a disagreement between Chinese President Xi Jinping and its Premier Li Keqiang is paralyzing officials who are responsible for growth in the world's second largest economy. While Li Keqiang has urged the authorities to bolster the Chinese economy and hit their predetermined growth targets, Xi Jinping continues to emphasize the need for pushing for zero coronavirus cases. Bloomberg, in that report, cited at least 8 local government officials and financial bureaucrats who are familiar with the matter who said that the confusion on whom to listen to President Xi or to Premier Li, is actually leading to further chaos. Earlier, the country's state broadcaster, the China Central Television, had reported that the Politburo's 7-member standing committee, which is the supreme decision-making body of the party, had pledged to fight against any speech that distorts or questions or rejects the COVID control policy. So what exactly is going on here? And will this have any impact on the upcoming 20th Congress of the Communist Party of China, which is due to happen this fall? This party Congress, it happens once in 5 years. This one is expected to ratify a historic 3rd term for Xi Jinping, something that no president in China has seen since Mao Zedong back in the 70s. After this, China had to put constitutional limits on 2 terms that one president can hold. That means a tenure of not more than 10 years. It's a bit like what US presidents also have, a 2-term limit. What we're seeing now is Li Keqiang, the premier, who could likely get replaced by the end of the year when the party congress happens. He's being put in the impossible position of trying to rescue the economy, yet at the same time, there is going to be no compromise on the one policy, zero COVID, the one policy that is causing the most economic damage. The Communist Party is, of course, trying to avoid any possible missteps, particularly in the handling of COVID outbreaks, before that leadership conclave later this year. But back to the story of Xi Jinping going missing from the front pages of People's Daily. The China Media Project, which broke this story, they took a slightly more long-term view and put into context Xi Jinping's relative absence from the front page of the newspaper. It would be extraordinary if there were to be any change of plans to the upcoming party congress and the expected endorsement of a 3rd term for Xi Jinping. It would be impossible, and I guess within the upper echelons of the Communist Party of China, even blasphemous to suggest that there could be a change of plans, to even suggest that Xi Jinping will not continue to be the supreme leader of China. Now, that said, it is difficult, inherently and by its very nature, to forecast in a political system that is designed to be opaque by default. And it is in this context that Xi Jinping will attempt to set the stage for the 20th Party Congress. The leadership shakedown, which will transform the party hierarchy, it will change the Politburo, the Central Committee. These are some of the topmost decision-making bodies of the Chinese Communist Party. The million-dollar question is, will Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang survive up until the fall, up until this leadership conclave?